Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbett. It's July 2, 2020, and today we are speaking with Dr. Charlotte Galloway, Senior Lecturer in Asian Art History and Curatorial Studies at the ANU, and Director of the Myanmar Research Centre, the institution hosting this podcast. Charlotte's PhD was on the Burmese Buddhist imagery of Bagan, one of the ancient capitals of Myanmar, and she maintains a strong research interest in that area. Hello, Charlotte.
Hi, Luke. How are you today?
Very well. It's quite a nice day here in Canberra, blue skies, and I can hear the same birds through your microphone as outside my window.
I'm not surprised. I must admit, the working from home during COVID-19 does have some upsides, and I'm very fortunate to have a nice view out my window through some treetops. And as you say, it's the lovely Canberra, blue skies, cold but bright winter day.
So I wanted to sort of start, once a foreigner arrives in Myanmar, they can't avoid hearing about Bagan. It's one of the 4 largest tourist attractions in the country, but the area doesn't have the same international profile as the remnants of other large temple cities in Southeast Asia and around the world. So first, what is it about Bagan that is so enchanting to Burmese people and to tourists?
Oh, look, that's a really good question, Luke. It's there are a number of reasons, perhaps, if I start with why it's not so well known around the world. And I think, compared to somewhere like Angkor, which most people are, foreigners are familiar with, and even somewhere like Borobudur in Indonesia, Bagan is just different. We've got, spread out over such an enormous, vast plain. There isn't a single monument that sort of attracts everyone's attention. But also, too, just the history of engagement in the last 50 years or really since post-World War II, it's been a bit of a struggle for people to even, enter the country at various times. So in a way, it's just a bit behind in terms of gaining that international reputation. But, what makes it so special and enchanting? I like that word. Because that's what really got me, there in the first place. Once I'd first visited back in 1999, I was essentially hooked. And I think there's just an amazing sort of solidity when we look at all the monuments. They just sit there. There's just such a wonderful quietness when you're there. And I'll never see every single temple in my lifetime. And maybe that's something too. There's always something new to see.
Yeah, there is. And you mentioned there all these quiet, solemn buildings, monuments, which are actually temples. So I wondered if you could describe one of these temples in Bagan and perhaps its art to our listeners, maybe the Ananda temple or perhaps your favourite, so that they can be taken there through their speakers, if you will.
Yes, okay. Favourite temples. Well, I actually have 2, and you just mentioned one. So the Ananda temple would probably be, it's the temple I know most closely. I wrote about it a fair bit in my PhD and have also just been back many times and written some other articles about the Ananda. When we talk about, as you said, it's not just temples at Bagan, but we have to remember this was it was an ancient capital. It was the first great Burman capital from 1044 as the sort of start of the reign of King Anorata, the first great king we read about in records. It was one of the largest capitals in Southeast Asia right through until its demise in the late 1200s, around 1284. And so at that time, through numerous reigns of numerous kings, it's all there because of this engagement with Theravada Buddhism. And I really have to start a little bit with here rather than launch straight into, I suppose, talking about the temples, because the reason for them being built and for their art and architecture to have evolved the way it has, we do have to appreciate the rationale for why Bagan is like it is. We have over, 4,000 remains of temples and stupas and monastic buildings. And all of these were built to support what we now call as karmatic Buddhist practice. And we all know about karma, and, good things happen if you accumulate lots of, if you live a good life and accumulate karma. And part of the way of earning karma, as it evolved in Myanmar and at Bagan, was through the donation of to build these monuments to Buddhism where people could go and worship, where you could also, support the local monkhood, the sangha. And so merit was, the practice of merit making really manifested itself in the building of these monuments. And of course, as part of that, there was also the decoration, the decorative parts of this, which included, inclusion of Buddha images, fantastic wall paintings, complex architectural designs on the exterior of buildings. And what's remarkable is that no two are the same. There is something different in every single one, even though after a while you think, crumbs, not another, sometimes, there's another temple, but they're all different. Which is really quite remarkable. So if I just talk about the Ananda was built by King Chanzita, who was the second great king during the Bagan Empire. And there's basically from the first period onwards, we see every great king builds what I sort of call a legacy temple. So during his reign, the king being the sort of, you only get to be a king and because you've gone through many cycles of rebirth, and you're now in a role which makes you sort of an earthly leader, and you also then become essentially a spiritual leader. So the king, through his demonstration of merit making, of creating these, fantastic temples, if we look at the ones made during each of the major kings' reigns, they tend to be the biggest ones made during those reigns. So if we look at something like the Ananda, this was built by King Chanzita. It's one of the most important temples at Bagan, and it's been in, quite amazingly, in continual worship and maintenance since it was built around 1105. So that's quite extraordinary in itself, and is a site of one of the Bagan's most important temple festivals, which is held every year. But the temple itself, what's so special about it? It's made in a design that, apart from the fact it's very large, it's a very unusual design. It's basically symmetrical. There's entrances facing north, south, east, and west. And it sort of stands as a monument to the Buddhist practices of the time that was really being sort of codified and standardized during Chanzita's reign. And it sort of is, you can see how this becomes a monument for sort of welcoming people from every single direction. And when you walk into these entrance halls, the sort of a plan is you would do a circumambulation in the entrance hall, and you pass by these wonderful stone sculptures of representing scenes from the Buddha's last life. Once you've done that, you do there's an ambulatory corridor that you would also circumambulate. And on the exterior walls, there's over 80 sculptures which detail the Buddha's last life from the time he knows he's going to be reborn on earth as a Buddha and right through to his attainment of enlightenment. Then there's an internal corridor, and once you get closer to the central core, this internal corridor is just filled with images of the Buddha in the mudras or the hand positions of enlightenment, and teaching, with a few also variants of meditation mudra as well. And these are the most common mudras we see in Myanmar. And then facing each direction are extremely large, tall, gilded images of the Buddhas of the current era, so the four past Buddhas, each facing their appropriate direction. Before you even enter the building, if we walk around the outside of the temple, we see these the ground plinth, what we call the ground plinth around set into the exterior of the wall of the temple at a height we can see. It's completely decorated with glazed plaques, which represent Mara's the final moment leading up to enlightenment, where the god Mara tries to distract the Buddha from attaining enlightenment, and all these creatures come, magical, fantastic creatures are depicted on these tiles. And these occupy one half of the ground plinth, and on the other half we see what we call the triumphant army. So there's depictions of the Devas from the heavens, the guardians from the various heavens as well, celebrating the Buddha's enlightenment. So you pass that first, and then you'd enter into the interior, as I said, the entrance halls. We go past these images of the Buddha's life, that external corridor again, with these depictions showing the path to enlightenment. And as you get closer to these central images, it's like you're learning and engaging more with Buddhism as well. And you move into this realm of the Buddha's teachings and these contemplative sort of states. But there's over 1,000 sculptures inside the Ananda temple. It's really quite amazing.
You talk a lot about their 1,000 sculptures, glazed plaques. Was there a lot of painting going on? I mean, we think about the Western traditions of religious buildings and paint and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, look, that was going to be my next point about the Ananda, because when I first went there, it's very common at Bagan to see whitewash over everything. The whitewashing has occurred over centuries on the inside of the buildings and also on the outside of some temples as a way of continual sort of support and merit making to maintain some of these more important temples. But what we didn't know was that underneath many of these layers of whitewash are all of these wonderful paintings. We knew there were wall paintings. There were wall paintings in many temples in Bagan. But, I look back on some of the early research I did on the Ananda, and at that point we weren't aware of the wall paintings. And there's been quite a lot of conservation work done over the last 10 years. And one of the projects has been removing whitewash. And in the Ananda, for example, we now see that the whole walls, we can tell everything was covered with wall paintings. And it's going to be impossible to, take off all of the whitewash. But in the representative areas where this is done, it gives you an idea of the complete sort of immersion that you get when you would have walked inside one of these temples. It also tells us a lot about some of the imagery, the sort of sophistication and understanding of Buddhist concepts. At the Ananda, for example, we now know that the entrance areas, when you walk in, you're walking past these enormous paintings of Brahmaloka. So the three-headed Brahma, which is not to be confused with the Brahma as a Hindu deity. But these are representing the Brahmaloka heavens. And so the whole temple also represents has a symbolism related to the different sort of levels of heavens within Buddhism. And the scenes scenes of daily life in the entrance areas, what looks like scenes of the Jataka stories on the internal walls, the Jatakas being depictions of the previous life of the Buddha. There's 550 or 547, depending on which country you're in. And this is how the Buddha accumulates merit over his many cycles of rebirth. The wall paintings are varied again throughout all of the temples. Smaller temples will often just be covered with multiple little images of the Buddha. It's just an incredibly, as I said, immersive experience.
We've got the wall paintings, the whitewashing, the sculptures, the Buddhist architecture. Are there any temples that are sort of outliers that do things quite differently to the others? And what can we learn from those about Bagan?
Look, I've just finished actually a research project at a group of temples near Minanthu, which is a village more on the outskirts, I suppose, of Bagan. And the imagery is different in different temples. It's a sort of mixed process. When we say different, it sort of follows similar schema. It's not totally unfamiliar. But what is evident in some temples, and I'm thinking here of Abhayadana Temple, which was also built, it's believed to be built by King Chanzita's queen. So even though King Chanzita built the Nagayon Temple and the Ananda Temple that was built under his patronage, and he is considered to have been the person to really, entrench Theravada Buddhist practice at Bagan. His wife was believed to have come from northern India or from Bengal, and she in her temple, there's actually quite a lot of what we'd call Mahayanist or sort of northern Buddhist imagery. And we see this also later in this group of temples out at Minanthu, and I'm thinking here of Payathonzu, which is a group of 3 smaller temples with fantastic wall painting. But the imagery is different, and we also have images of people with Chinese facial features and costumes. So what does this all tell us? And these are only 2 examples. It tells us really that Bagan was probably a very, I suppose, religiously tolerant society. It was very accepting of different types of Buddhist practices. We also have a temple there, just one, which has Hindu iconography. That's at the Nat Lang Chang. And that was probably there to support the Brahmanical practices which happen in court rituals. But also, it may well have been just that we had a community of Indian people from India who worshipped, were followers of Hinduism, and this was their temple. It actually was really quite a religiously diverse place. And I think that's what's so fascinating when we study the iconography we see. Because we often, history often records Bagan as being and Myanmar as being a very Theravada Buddhist place. But I think, as we all know, it's actually much more complex than that.
Right, and Bagan was hardly isolated during the centuries that it had hegemony. I mean, society must have evolved constantly. How else do we see that in the art of Bagan? Like, where do the influences come from?
Oh, look, it's very much the original art and architecture that we see at Bagan. And I'm talking here, Bagan was, there's evidence of settlement at Bagan from at least the start of the Common Era. It was likely there were some Buddhist temples already built there during what we call the Pew period, which came before Bagan. And there's some really interesting archaeological research happening in that space. But if we're talking about the real sort of development of the Bagan period, it was very much influenced by Indian Buddhist art and also Hindu art. And I say that because the styles are very closely related to Pala India, which was Mahayana Buddhist, but also Hindu during this period in the sort of coming through the 10th to 11th centuries. There's some discussion too because Buddhists were starting to become persecuted more in India during this period. Bagan was becoming, the upholders of Buddhism. And so we think, that artisans also made their way to Bagan. There was connections through to China, and during the Tang dynasty, of course, the Chinese Tang dynasty was also Buddhist. And, of course, we have Thailand next door, which, there weren't really borders back then, but the Dvaravati kingdoms. And as Thailand developed, there was quite a lot of interaction right across the region.
You've mentioned now a couple of times ongoing research projects. So I wonder, are there any archaeological digs still taking place in Bagan currently? And connected to that, what are the major mysteries of this enigmatic former capital? What are historians and other researchers still deeply intrigued by and trying to find out?
How long can I make the list?
Well, just exercise your judgment.
No, this is a fascinating thing because there is just still so much to do. Honestly, if anyone wants to do a PhD, Bagan, just go there. There's a lifetime's worth of discovery. Look, there's a lot more archaeological excavation to take place. It's been an interesting thing since access to Myanmar has improved and since they've moved on their road to democratic reform. There's been a lot more engagement with international experts in these areas. And during 2016, there was a major earthquake at Bagan. At the same time, they were preparing their nomination dossier for World Heritage listing for Bagan. And it was just in a way, it's never good timing for an earthquake, but it meant that there was a lot of international engagement happening at that time. And they were able to bring in many international experts to assist in the assessment of the damage and also start planning the repairs. So that's actually set up led to quite a number of ongoing projects and excavation or archaeological projects. One on just what sort of specific areas where I suppose our biggest lack of knowledge might be. Things like habitation sites. We've got all the temples. They've excavated a palace site within the old city walls, but we don't have a lot of information about other habitation sites. So there's a group from Trent University in Canada who've been doing excavation looking for habitation sites, and that's been quite interesting. And we're talking, places where, villagers might have lived. Kiln sites. All the temples at Bagan are made of bricks. Where did they actually make them? There hasn't been much excavation of kiln sites or writing about the kiln technology. The same applies for the glazed plaques. More work needs to be done on the technology that was being used to create the glazes and so on. That's probably, two areas where we still need a lot more research. There's still unexcavated mounds where we know there are temples under them that just haven't been excavated. So plenty of work to do.
It's interesting that you brought up the habitation sites, because a question I was really keen to ask you was, are there any still standing secular kinds of buildings? Are there any ancient buildings from this capital that are not explicitly Buddhist or connected to, spiritual concerns? Have we found anything?
The short answer is there are no existing structures from that period that are secular. As I said, they've excavated what they believe is Chanzita's palace site, and very complex large buildings. So we see the remainder of teak posts and foundations. So we can get a pretty good idea of what buildings looked like because of the wall paintings as well. There's some wonderfully interesting reconstructions actually in the large archaeological museum at Bagan, which looks at what buildings might have looked like, secular buildings, based on wall paintings. But unfortunately, of course, most of those buildings were all made of timber and also of, woven matted roofs, and they've just all perished over time. The only thing is, though, there are villages, there that we believe have been around since the Bagan period. Of course, the buildings have been rebuilt, but there still are local villages within the Bagan site.
Yeah. And it makes perfect sense that if there's a nice place for a house based on, geological factors, it was probably a nice place for a house 800 years ago too.
Yes, exactly. And it's a sort of curious thing. I mean, in Bagan if we look at what's happened at other ancient capital sites, I mean, again, embedded not only just with Buddhism, but also there's a deep belief in what we call the Nat spirits. And I know on a previous interview you've spoke with Sally Bamford, who talked wonderfully about the Nats in Myanmar. And these sort of spirits, there's a sort of association with place too, and this interaction with karma that, if your kingdom falls, the new king's not going to want to keep on reigning in that particular place. And we certainly see later in history, particularly around Mandalay, that the capital would move relatively frequently when a new king came into the throne, particularly if the old king had perhaps left the throne in not the best of circumstances. So when the Kublai Khan's armies actually came through into upper part of Myanmar, the king in Bagan actually fled, and so that was the end of the capital. Any new king was not going to come back and reassert his authority over a place where the previous king had fled. So the buildings don't get maintained then. They don't maintain the palaces, and it's assumed it would have just fallen into disrepair.
All right, let's shift now to the broader historiography. of Myanmar. And so something that you've discovered in the years you've spent studying the art in the temples of Bagan is that sometimes that art can go against the established historical narrative of events, and sometimes they can confirm it. So how can studying art, and in particular the art of Bagan, contribute to history?
What's, I think, is really interesting here, particularly with Bagan and particularly through, say, the 11th century, we actually have very little in the way of inscriptional evidence of anything. There are inscriptions, often donor inscriptions, but we don't have much in the way of text. So the visual, what we see in terms of visual images is often what we have to rely on to try and sort of create some understanding of history. And this is where, say, studying the wall paintings in particular gives us a great insight into life in this period. We see the types of ploughs they used in fields. We see the sort of boats they had, how they did their fishing. We see images of festivals and rituals. And as has been done in other parts of Southeast Asia, and certainly as has been done at Angkor and at Borobudur, once we start to create these understandings of and pictures of what life was like, it enables us then to compare, say, for example, things like ploughs or musical instruments. We can then make connections of, gee whiz, it looks like this in Bagan, through looking at the paintings, because we don't have the physical object. And wow, the ones in Cambodia looked a little bit different, but hey, then later there's something similar going on here. And so we can actually use this information to build up a much better understanding of the cross-cultural interactions that happened, and all of that sort of political interactions between kingdoms and cultural exchange absolutely informs not only our knowledge of the past, but helps us understand current day sort of relationships as well between countries.
All right. As we come towards the end, maybe we can go back to the beginning of our chat. And in the years, you said you first went to Bagan in 1999. Since then, how has the wider town area of Bagan and the temples themselves, how has it changed in material terms? Is the current regime for tourism, for research, for livelihoods, the people who live there, is it the best it's ever been, or what could be done better?
Look, I think like any, I suppose tracing that sort of trajectory of what's happened in Bagan in the last 20 years, you really can divide it up into pre-2010, when we start to see the government change in Myanmar, and post-2010. Pre-2010, there was very little change over the 10 years that I was visiting Bagan. Tourism was fairly limited. People had to stay in government hotels. There was sort of limited number of those. You could only stay in Myanmar for, when I first started going there, you could only get a visa for 7 days. Then it extended to 14. So it was actually quite, I suppose, stable in terms of change, and fairly quiet in Bagan. In the last decade, certainly in the last 5 years, as interest in Myanmar has certainly increased, there's been a rapid growth in tourism at Bagan. This has meant New Bagan, the city old town that is, it's a bit of a controversy there when back in the 1990s, the then military government moved the people from Old Bagan out of the area within the old city walls and relocated them about 5 miles or 7 kilometres down the road. And so, but New Bagan has now developed into quite an significant place for tourists to stay. And likewise, Nha U, the major town where the airport is, has also grown a lot. But most of the services are for tourism rather than other local industries. So at the moment, I have to say, well, as you know, Luke, I also worked on the UNESCO World Heritage nomination dossier for Bagan, and Bagan joined the World Heritage Register only last year in July. And, that was greeted with a great deal of enthusiasm. And, there's great hopes for economic development and that Bagan will, generate a lot of tourism income for an area where there is otherwise not an awful lot. But, of course, at the moment, it's just very, very quiet. Some of my colleagues have been, and in fact UNESCO has been doing some really good little videos of some of the sites throughout Southeast Asia now that tourism's just, people aren't there, and it's just amazing to see what it looks like. It is very quiet. Just one of those other questions you asked there, Luke, too. The development, I think part of the issue, though, with Bagan and certainly its future is there needs to be a lot of work done on managing tourism and expansion at Bagan. There are many laws and rules and regulations in place as a very comprehensive site management plan. But however, enforcing those rules and regulations is another matter. And this is something new for people in Myanmar as well. And it's trying to control the development and put in place tourism which is sustainable for the site is one of the biggest challenges going forwards.
Yeah, I know that there are a huge number of hotels there. And speaking of, sensitive matters, I'm sure that how would I characterize them? Maybe archaeological purists would be quite appalled at the sight of some of those hotels and the development that's gone on in and around all of those temples. So do you think that that's mostly over, or can we expect more rich men just putting hotels wherever they want, no matter what might be underground?
I think we'd like to think this will stop. It's no secret there were a couple of, quite well-known projects that were still going ahead during the nomination process, and that will, and they will be completed, that are being built in what would be considered in the middle of the heritage zone. But I think going forwards, one thing that UNESCO listing does offer is some degree of protection for the site. So there are requirements and reporting that has to be met, and it's, I suppose, up to the Myanmar government to decide, how they're going to respond to some of these development issues. There are quite clearly defined areas now in the management plan for future hotels as a way of, protecting the site. But at the moment, it's still, I'd have to say, in a transition into managing a site like this in a truly, I suppose, internationally acceptable framework.
Yeah, and last thing on that, are there any plans or interest for something similar to take place, for example, in Inwa, which is quite close to Mandalay and has a similar sort of, for a layman like myself, a lot of the temples there look pretty similar of the same vintage?
Yeah, look, that's a good question too. It's a case of, where do you draw the line with, say, having a World Heritage site as opposed to managing your own heritage? And this is a debate that I certainly raise in my conversations in Myanmar of, they've now got 2 World Heritage listed sites, the Pew Ancient Cities and Bagan. Not every site needs World Heritage listing, but certainly the site should have some sort of national heritage protection. And something like Inwa, I'm thinking, how would you say it had World Heritage significance? So there's very strict criteria for that. But of course, it has very significant national heritage importance. And perhaps, the government, this is an area where they will need good support to develop, a national heritage framework as well.
Just about lastly, you do research on all kinds of things and places to do with art and history, but you're still doing research in Myanmar and you're also teaching there. So maybe could you just discuss any research projects that you're currently on that are currently, firing your drive, your thirst for knowledge, and how the archaeological community in Myanmar is coming along, for lack of a better term?
As you said, I've been doing some teaching in Myanmar. I do some teaching in the archaeology department at Yangon Uni. There I actually teach museology, And I also do some teaching on, research writing. There's quite a lot of, activity in developing their capacity in those areas, which is great. And I also do a fair bit of, I suppose teaching, but it's in capacity building. I like to think of it as joint knowledge sharing because I get so much out of it myself. At museums, I've been doing workshops at the National Museum in Naypyidaw, in Bagan, and also at the Sri Kshetra Museum near Phrae. And with the staff there, we've been doing a lot of work on how to document and catalogue works in their collections. And this sort of training is just, as I said, I love talking with them all. I give them some information about, international language around, how you describe objects, and particularly in relation to a lot of the Buddhist material. I get a lot of information from them about, local terms of how they call particular, iconographic features and so on. And I really just see it's just terrific to see them engaging now with the international communities. Myanmar's now a member of ICOM, the International Council of Museums, and they've recently set up their own chapter of ICOMOS, the International Council of Museums and Sites. And we're giving some support to just develop those frameworks as well. And likewise in the archaeology department, it's been great to see, apart from, COVID-19 and us not being able to be there, but they are now in a position where they've been able to develop, online teaching resources. It's great to see the sort of confidence and their engagement with the international community becoming now self-sustaining, which is terrific.
Are there graduate students passing through the archaeological department at Yangon University and studying Bagan?
Yes, though there's a sort of complex arrangement there because the university's archaeological departments don't actually do excavation. So they learn the theory of archaeology. They do surface sort of mapping and so on at different sites. They go to Bagan a lot. And in fact, quite a bit of what they do is what I would call art historical research, analysis of temple architecture, wall paintings and the like. Students need to go then to the Field School of Archaeology, which is actually run within the Ministry of Religious Affairs and Culture, and that's where they do their training in excavation. So students have to do their undergraduate first, which they do through the Ministry of Education. I think there's 5 different archaeological departments in Myanmar at the moment, and then they'll go on to do their graduate diplomas at Phrae.
Interesting. Okay. Well, thank you so much for all of your time today. The final thing we always do is get some recommendations. I'm sure you have a list a mile long of what you could recommend people regarding Bagan, but this is your chance for anything you would like to recommend to our listeners.
The things I always do when I go back, and I've listening to some of your previous Myanmar musings, there is still something special about the Shwe Dagon in Yangon. Just got to go back and just sit and look. Just love sitting and looking. But when I'm in Bagan, and I'm sort of almost hesitant to say, I just get my e-bike, the electric bikes, because I don't want anyone falling off on their e-bikes. Just be careful, the sand is very slippery, go slowly. But I absolutely love, the first thing I do is I'll get the e-bike, I will just get on, go down meander off a dirt path, and you just find a quiet spot and sit and look. It is just wonderful. I just soak it all in. You see, we started off by listening to bird calls. You see the bird calls. You can find this sort of quiet spot, might be there by the edge of the river. It might just be, sitting for a moment inside a temple when you're on your own. And just waiting for a pause. I think that's what I like most about it. I love being able to sit there and I can just sit and the rest of the world just washes over me. It's wonderful.
Yeah, and no matter how many tourists there may be in Bagan on that day, there's always an empty temple.
There is always an empty temple.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Charlotte, for coming on to Myanmar Musings. I mean, we could do a whole series on different aspects of Bagan, but I think this was a pretty good start and overview. So thank you so much.
A pleasure, Luke.